The Ideal of Human Unity, Chapter 10, The United States of Europe. We have had to dwell so long upon the possibilities of the empire group because the evolution of the imperial state is a dominating phenomenon of the modern world. It governs the political tendencies of the later part of the 19th and earlier part of the 20th centuries, very much as the evolution of the free, democratized nation governed the age which preceded ours. The dominant idea of the French Revolution was the formula of the free and sovereign people, and in spite of the cosmopolitan element introduced into the revolutionary formula by the ideal of fraternity, this idea became, in fact, the assertion of the free, independent, democratically self-governed nation. That ideal had not at the time of the Great War wholly worked itself out, even in the Occidental world, for Central Europe was only partly democratized, and Russia had only just begun to turn its face towards the common goal. And even now there are still subject European peoples, or fragments of peoples. Footnote 1. No longer an evident fact, although the substitution of a state of vassalage may still be there. Nevertheless, with whatever imperfections, the idea of the free democratic nation had practically triumphed in all America and Europe. The peoples of Asia have equally accepted this governing ideal of the 19th century. And though the movements of democratic nationalism in the eastern countries, Turkey, Persia, India, China, were not fortunate in their first attempts at self-realization, the profound and widespread working of the idea cannot be doubted by any careful observer. Whatever modifications may arrive, whatever new tendencies intervene, whatever reactions oppose, it could hardly be doubted that the principal gifts of the French Revolution must remain and be universalized as permanent acquisitions, indispensable elements in the future order of the world. National self-consciousness and self-government, freedom and enlightenment for the people, and so much social equality and justice, at least as is indispensable to political liberty. But with any form of fixed and rigid inequality, democratic self-government is incompatible. But before the great 19th century impulse could work itself out everywhere, before even it could realize itself entirely in Europe, a new tendency has intervened, and a new idea seized on the progressive mind of humanity. This is the ideal of the perfectly organized state. Fundamentally, the ideal of the perfectly organized state is socialistic, and it is based on the second word of the great revolutionary formula, equality, just as the movement of the 19th century centered around the first, liberty. The first impulse given by the great European upheaval attained only to a certain kind of political equality. An incomplete social leveling still left untouched the one inequality and the one form of political preponderance which no competitive society can eliminate: the preponderance of the haves over the have-nots, the inequality between the more successful in the struggle of life and the less successful, which is rendered inevitable by difference of capacity, unequal opportunity, and the handicap of circumstance and environment. Socialism seeks to get rid of this persistent inequality by destroying the competitive form of society and substituting the cooperative. A cooperative form of human society existed formerly in the shape of the commune, but the restoration of the commune as a unit would imply practically the return to the old city-state. And as this is not now possible, with the larger groupings and greater complexities of modern life, the socialistic idea could only be realized through the rigorously organized national state. To eliminate poverty, not by the crude idea of equal distribution, but by the holding of all property in common and its management through the organized state, to equalize opportunity and capacity as far as possible through universal education and training, again by means of the organized state, is the fundamental idea of modern socialism. It implies an abrogation, or at least a rigorous diminution, of all individual liberty. Democratic socialism still clings indeed to the 19th century ideal of political freedom. It insists on the equal right of all in the state to choose, judge, and change their own governors. But all other liberty it is ready to sacrifice to its own central idea. The progress of the socialistic idea would seem, therefore, to lead towards the evolution of a perfectly organized national state, which would provide for and control the education and training, manage and govern all the economic activities, and for that purpose, as well as for the assurance of perfect efficiency, morality, well-being, and social justice, order the whole, or at any rate the greater part, of the external and internal life of its component individuals. It would effect, in fact, by organized state control, what earlier societies attempted by social pressure: rigorous rule of custom, minute code, and shastra. This was always an inherently inevitable development of the revolutionary ideal. It started to the surface at first, under pressure of external danger in the government of France by the Jacobins during the Reign of Terror. It has been emerging and tending to realize itself under pressure of an inner necessity throughout the later part of the 19th century. It has emerged, not completely, but with a first rudimentary sketch of completeness, by the combination of the inner and the outer necessity during the present war. What was before only an ideal towards which some imperfect initial steps alone were immediately possible, has now become a realizable program, with its entire feasibility established by a convincing, though necessarily hasty and imperfect, practical demonstration. It is true that in order to realize it, even political liberty has had to be temporarily abolished. But this, it may be argued, is only an accident of the moment, a concession to temporary necessity. In freer conditions, what was done partly and for a time by governments which the people have consented to invest with an absolute and temporarily irresponsible authority may be done, when there is no pressure of war, wholly and permanently by the self-governing democratic state. In that case, the near future of the human group would seem to be the nation, self-governing, politically free, but aiming at perfect social and economic organization, and ready for that purpose to hand over all individual liberty to the control of the organized national state. Here again we have footnote number 2. This was done with a stupendous beginning of thoroughness in Bolshevist Russia, Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and the necessity or the choice of it threatened at one time to spread everywhere. As France was, in the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century, the great propagandist and the experimental workshop of political liberty and equality, so Germany has been in the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century the chief propagandist and the experimental workshop of the idea of the organized state. There, the theory of socialism has taken rise, and there its propaganda has been most effective, so that a large proportion of the nation committed itself to the new gospel. There also the great socialistic measures, and those which have developed the control of the individual by the state for the common good and efficiency of the nation, have been most thoroughly and admirably conceived and executed. It matters little that this was done by an anti-socialistic, militarist, and aristocratic government. The very fact is a proof of the irresistible strength of the new tendency, and the inevitable transference of the administrative power from its past holders to the people was all that was needed to complete its triumph. Throughout the recent decades, we have seen the growth of German ideas and the increasing tendency to follow German methods of state interference and state control in other countries, even in England, the home of individualism. The defeat of Germany in the European War no more spelt the defeat of her ideals than the defeat of revolutionary and Napoleonic France by the European coalition, and even the temporary triumph of the monarchic and aristocratic system prevented the spread of her new ideas over all Europe. Even if German militarism and Junkerism were destroyed, the collapse of the imperial form of government can only hasten the more thorough development and victory of that which has been working behind them and forcing them to minister to it, the great modern tendency of the perfectly organized socialistic state, while the evident result of the war in the nations opposed to her has been to force them more rapidly towards the same ideal. If this were all, the natural development of things, aided by the frustration of the German form of imperialism, would lead logically to a new ordering of the world on the basis of a system of independent but increasingly organized national states, associated together more or less closely for international purposes, while preserving their independent existence. Such is the ideal which has attracted the human mind as a yet distant possibility since the great revolutionary ferment set in. It is the idea of a federation of free nations, the parliament of man, the federation of the world. But the actual circumstances forbid any hope of such an ideal consummation in the near future. For the nationalistic, democratic, and socialistic ideas are not alone at work in the world. Imperialism is equally in the ascendant. Only a few European peoples at the present moment are nations confined to themselves. Each is a nation free in itself, but dominating over other human groupings who are not free or only partially free. Even little Belgium has its Congo, little Portugal its colonies, little Holland its dependencies in the eastern archipelago. Even little Balkan states have aspired to revive an empire and to rule over others, not of their own nationality, or have cherished the idea of becoming predominant in the peninsula. Mazzini's Italy has its imperialistic ventures and ambitions in Tripoli, Abyssinia, Albania, the Greek islands. This imperialistic tendency is likely to grow stronger for some time in the future, rather than to weaken. The idea of a remodeling, even of Europe itself, on the strict principle of nationality, which captivated liberal minds in England at the beginning of the war, has not yet been made practicable, and, if it were effected, there would still remain the whole of Asia and Africa as a field for the imperialistic ambitions of the Western nations and Japan. The disinterestedness that led a majority in America to decree the liberation of the Philippines and restrained the desire to take advantage of the troubles of Mexico is not possible to the mentality of the Old World, and it is doubtful how long it can stand, even in America, against the rising tide of imperialistic sentiment. National egoism, the pride of domination, and the desire of expansion still govern the mind of humanity. However modified they may now be in their methods by the first weak beginnings of higher motives and a better national morality. And until this spirit is radically changed, the union of the human race by a federation of free nations must remain a noble chimera. Undoubtedly, a free association and unity must be the ultimate goal of our development, and until it is realized, the world must be subject to constant changes and revolutions. Every established order, because it is imperfect, because it insists on arrangements which come to be recognized as involving injustice, or which stand in the way of new tendencies and forces, because it outlasts its utility and justification, must end in malaise, resistance, and upheaval, must change itself, or be changed, or else lead to cataclysms such as periodically trouble our human advance. But the time has not come when the true principle of order can replace those which are artificial and imperfect. It is idle to hope for a federation of free nations. until either the present inequalities between nation and nation are removed, or else the whole world rises to a common culture based upon a higher moral and spiritual status than is now actual or possible. The imperial instinct, being alive and dominant, and stronger at present than the principle of nationalism, the evolution of great empires can hardly fail to overshadow for a time, at least, the tendency to the development of free nationalities. All that can be hoped is that the old artificial, merely political empire may be replaced by a truer and more moral type, and that the existing empires, driven by the necessity of strengthening themselves and by an enlightened self-interest, may come to see that the recognition of national autonomy is a wise and necessary concession to the still vital instinct of nationalism, and can be used so as to strengthen, instead of weakening, their imperial strength and unity. In this way, while a federation of free nations is for the present impossible, a system of federated empires and free nations drawn together in a closer association than the world has yet seen is not altogether impossible. And through this and other steps, some form of political unity for mankind may at a more or less distant date be realizable. And we have here footnote number 3. The appearance of Hitler and the colossal attempt at German world domination have paradoxically helped by his defeat, and the reaction against him entirely altered the world circumstances. The United States of Europe is now a practical possibility and has begun to feel towards self-accomplishment. The war brought up many suggestions for such a closer association, but as a rule, they were limited to a better ordering of the international relations of Europe. One of these was the elimination of war by a stricter international law, administered by an international court and supported by the sanction of the nations, which shall be enforced by all of them against any offender. Such a solution is chimerical unless it is immediately followed up by farther and far-reaching developments. For the law given by the court must be enforced, either by an alliance of some of the stronger powers, as, for instance, the coalition of the victorious allies dominating the rest of Europe, or by a concert of all the European powers, or else by a United States of Europe, or some other form of European federation. A dominating alliance of great powers would be simply a repetition in principle of the system of Metternich, and would inevitably break down after some lapse of time, while a concert of Europe must mean, as experience has shown, the uneasy attempt of rival groupings to maintain a precarious understanding, which may postpone but cannot eventually prevent fresh struggles and collisions. In such imperfect systems, the law would only be obeyed so long as it was expedient, so long only as the powers who desired new changes and readjustments, not admitted by the others, did not consider the moment opportune for resistance. The law within a nation is only secure because there is a recognized authority empowered to determine it, and to make the necessary changes, and possessed of a sufficient force to punish all violation of its statutes. An international or an inter-European law must have the same advantages if it is to exercise anything more than a merely moral force, which can be set at naught by those who are strong enough to defy it, and who find an advantage in the violation. Some form of European federation, however loose, is therefore essential if the idea behind these suggestions of a new order is to be made practically effective. And once commenced, such a federation must necessarily be tightened, and draw more and more towards the form of a United States of Europe. Whether such a European unity can be formed, or whether, if formed, it can be maintained and perfected against the many forces of dissolution, the many causes of quarrel which would for long try it to the breaking point, only experience can show. But it is evident that in the present state of human egoism it would, if formed, become a tremendously powerful instrument for the domination and exploitation of the rest of the world by the group of nations which are present in the forefront of human progress. It would inevitably awaken in antagonism to it an idea of Asiatic unity and an idea of American unity, and while such continental groupings, replacing the present smaller national unities, might well be an advance towards the final union of all mankind, yet their realization would mean cataclysms of a kind and scope which would dwarf the present catastrophe, and in which the hopes of mankind might founder and fatally collapse, rather than progress nearer to fulfillment. But the chief objection to the idea of a United States of Europe is that the general sense of humanity is already seeking to travel beyond its continental distinctions and make them subordinate to a larger human idea. A division on the continental basis might therefore be, from this point of view, a reactionary step of the gravest kind, and might be attended with the most serious consequences to human progress. Europe, indeed, is in this anomalous position, that it is at once ripe for the pan-European idea, and at the same time under the necessity of overpassing it. The conflict of the two tendencies was curiously exemplified not so long ago by certain speculations on the nature of the recent European struggle. It was suggested that the sin of Germany in this war was due to its exaggerated egoistic idea of the nation and its disregard of the larger idea of Europe, to which the nation idea must now be subjected and subordinated. The total life of Europe must now be the all-engrossing unity. Its good, the paramount consideration, and the egoism of the nation must consent to exist only as an organic part of this larger egoism. In effect, this is the acceptance, after so many decades, of the idea of Nietzsche, who insisted that nationalism and war were anachronisms, and the ideal of all enlightened minds must be not to be good patriots, but good Europeans. But immediately the question arose, What then of the increasing importance of America in world politics? What of Japan and China? What of the renewed stirrings of life in Asia? The writer had therefore to draw back from his first formula, and to explain that by Europe he meant not Europe, but all nations that had accepted the principles of European civilization as the basis of their polity and social organization. This more philosophical formula has the obvious, or at least the specious, advantage that it brings in America and Japan, and thus recognizes all the actually free or dominant nations in the circle of the proposed solidarity, and holds out, too, the hope of admission into the circle to others, whenever they can prove, after the forceful manner of Japan or otherwise, that they, too, have come up to the European standard. Indeed, though Europe is still strongly separate in its own conception from the rest of the world, as was shown by the often expressed resentment of the continual existence of Turkey in Europe, and the desire to put an end to this government of Europeans by Asiatics, yet, as a matter of fact, it is inextricably tangled up with America and Asia. Some of the European nations have colonies in America. All have possessions and ambitions in Asia, where Japan alone is outside the shadow cast by Europe, or in North Africa, which is culturally one with Asia. The United States of Europe would therefore mean a federation of free European nations dominant over a half-subject Asia, and possessor of parts of America, and there standing in uneasy proximity to nations still free and necessarily troubled, alarmed, and overshadowed by this giant immiscence. The inevitable result would be, in America, to bring together more closely the Latin center and South and the English-speaking North, and to emphasize immensely the Monroe Doctrine, with consequences which cannot easily be foreseen, while in Asia there could be only one of two final endings to the situation. Either the disappearance of the remaining free Asiatic states, or a vast Asiatic resurgence and the recoil of Europe from Asia. Such movements would be a prolongation of the old line of human development, and set at naught the new cosmopolitan conditions created by modern culture and science. But they are inevitable if the nation idea in the West is to merge into the Europe idea, that is to say, into the continental idea, rather than into the wider consciousness of a common humanity. If, therefore, any new supranational order is to evolve sooner or later as a result of the present upheaval, it must be an association that will embrace Asia, Africa, and America, as well as Europe, and it must be in its nature an organization of international life, constituted by a number of free nations, such as Sweden, Norway, Denmark, the United States, the Latin republics, and a number of imperial and colonizing nations, such as are most of the peoples of Europe. Either the latter would remain, as they now are, free in themselves, but masters of subject peoples who, with the advance of time, would become more and more intolerant of the yoke imposed on them, or else they would be, by an ethical advance, which is as yet very far from accomplished, partly centers of free federal empires, partly nations holding in trust races yet backward and undeveloped, until they arrived at the capacity of self-administration, as the United States have claimed to hold for a time the Philippines. In the former case, the unity, the order, the common law established would perpetuate and be partly founded on an enormous system of injustice, and exposed to the revolts and revolutions of nature, and the great revenges by which he finally vindicates the human spirit against wrongs which she tolerates for a time as necessary incidents of human development. In the latter, there would be some chance that the new order, however far in its beginnings from the ultimate ideal of a free association of free human aggregates, might lead peacefully, and by a natural unfolding of the spiritual and ethical progress of the race, to such a secure, just, and healthy political, social, and economic foundation as might enable mankind to turn from its preoccupation with these cares and begin at last that development of its higher self which is the nobler part of its potential destiny, or if not that, for who knows whether nature's long experiment in the human type is foredoomed to success or failure, at least the loftiest possibility of our future, which the human mind can envisage.